to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to show you examples when the natural-looking move is not as good as it seems. Even when experienced players or grandmasters see such opportunities, once in a while it turns out to be a mistake. So don't feel bad if time to time it happens to you too. Here is the first example. In this position, White moved his rook to e5, which is attacking the black queen on h5. Generally, when a piece is being attacked, we have 3 or 4 different options to react to that. The most simple and natural one is to run away to a safe square where the attacked piece will not be captured. The next option is to put another piece in between. In this case, that could be to move up the pawn from f7 to f5 and interpose, and therefore block the rook's attack on the black queen. Another option is to capture our attacker. In this case, that would be the queen capturing the rook. And finally, the last option that we may have is to counterattack. Ignore the attack made to our queen and ignore and capture White's pawn on d4 in this case and attack White's queen. In this case, if rook would capture the queen and so would the black rook, things would work out great for black, because now black already won a pawn, as well as now attacking the rook on h5 and the bishop on a2 all at the same time. And therefore, this would greatly favor black. Going back to the start, and again, playing rook e5, rook d4, however, this would be a mistake for black, because White, in addition to capturing the queen, can also choose to capture black's rook. And that would win a rook for White, because now the queen protects the rook on e5. And therefore, White's advantage would become quite significant. Going back again to the position after rook e5, we'll learn that in this case, black's best choice is to capture that rook, even though it seems that the white pawn now can capture the queen. And while it certainly can, it will not result in any gain for White, because now the black rook will capture the white queen, and if you look around, you will see that black has a full extra rook with no compensation whatsoever on the white side. So in our starting position, rook e5 is a big mistake. White should be playing more on the defensive at the moment to protect the pawn on h4, for example, by playing queen f4, making sure that black cannot win the pawn. Let's move on to our next example, where White has an excellent position, having an extra pawn. Moreover, that pawn is far advanced and has a bright future. Also, in addition to that, the black king has a lot of weaknesses right around its safety, because the black pawn from g7 has already moved up 1 square to g6, and therefore the dark squares around the black king became very vulnerable. Therefore, in this position, White has a very natural-looking and strong-looking attacking move, moving the queen to f6, immediately threatening to checkmate with queen g7 or queen h8 with the help of the bishop on b2. However, in this very case, it would be a blunder, because it would allow for black to win the game and in fact checkmate in just a couple of moves. Always, always look out for your opponent's threats and attacking possibilities, not just your own. In this case, black would be able to capture the pawn on e3 because the queen left and it no longer protects it. And when the king moves out of the check, the black queen would come down to d1 and announce checkmate. Therefore, in the starting position, white had to be more careful and make some preparatory moves. For example, moving the rook down to c1, making sure that black queen will not end up checkmating us on d1. Let's move on to the next example. Here we go. In this example, white has a huge material advantage, still having the queen on the board, while the only thing that black has that white doesn't is a second rook. But as we know, the difference in value between a queen and a rook is quite significant, namely 4 points. Also, we can notice that the black king is quite vulnerable because the defensive g-pawn is missing from g7. And that is an invitation to try to create an attack with the queen and the bishop against black's king. However, I can't stress it enough, you need to be careful and look out for your opponent's opportunities as well. If white would make the natural-looking queen e4 move, which certainly has an impressive threat by checkmating on h7, that would be a blunder because it would position all of a sudden the white queen along the same diagonal with the white king. And what happens then is that the black bishop can make a pin with bishop c6 attacking white's queen, and that queen cannot run away. And the best white can do is capture black's bishop, but that's of course a huge loss. In the starting position, white pretty much should do anything but play queen e4. The plan of playing queen e4 is right. However, the timing would be wrong. White would need first to move the king out to a dark square where it's not in any potential danger, and then on the following move, queen e4 could be a threat. Let's move on. Here we go. In this position, we see white having some material advantage, having an extra rook versus black's bishop and pawn. Also, white has a strong position already with one of his rooks on the 7th rank. As we know, the rooks are extremely strong on the 7th rank from white's perspective, and of course it would be the 2nd ranks from black's perspective, when the king is still down on the 8th rank. So if both rooks can be on the 7th rank, typically that's a huge advantage, because oftentimes we attack the opponent's pawns which are still there, or even threaten with checkmate. For example, if in this position black would move the bishop and attack the rook from g5, white could immediately checkmate in a couple of moves with check, followed by another check capturing the pawn, and then the second rook moving to g7, checkmate. So the plan again is great. That is the plan to get both rooks to the 7th. The problem is that it would be again the wrong timing, because the black bishop now would have the opportunity to give a check, which would be a fork, attacking the white rook as well as king at the same time. What would happen? The king would need to move out of the check, and then bishop captures rook, rook captures bishop, and black won material. As we know, the rook is more valuable than the bishop, 5 points versus only 3. Going back to the starting position, it's clear that white should not move the rook to e7, and while the rook is attacked right now, the rook could move away to a safe square of opposite color of black's bishop, and then after their king would be moving out of that diagonal, for example to a4, white could try to prepare to get the rook to the 7th rank. Let's move on. Here we go. In this opposite colored rook and bishop endgame, white has some advantage because they have a passed pawn on the A file that's not so easy to stop. In fact, white's bishop on E4 is already aiming at that promotion square, so at a future time, possibly, when the white pawn would be almost promoting and the black rook would want to hold it off on A8, that bishop would already be supporting it. Another thing to notice is that the pawn on C7 is unprotected. However, this is one of those situations when this is a sneaky trap on black's part. If white now captures that pawn, that would be a big mistake because it would put white's king and rook on the same file, allowing black to create a skewer by giving a check with the rook, and then when the king moves out of the C file and that it doesn't have a choice, then rook takes rook, giving black a huge gain. Naturally, in this position, white is not forced to capture that pawn. White could, for example, move the king out of the C file or push the A pawn, either of them being much better than capturing on C7. Always, always look out for your opponent's good moves. Let's move on to the next example. Here we go. In this endgame, white is doing very well. White has still the queen on the board, while black doesn't, although they have two knights which white doesn't have. The balance, white has 9 extra points versus black's 6. So white is up by 3 points, which is quite significant, especially when we are talking about an endgame. In this position, if we look around, we can notice that black has the knight hanging on E5, or at least so it seems. Always be suspicious of your opponent just giving you something. Look around and be sure it's not a trap. Like in this position, if white indeed goes and captures that knight that seems like a free lunch, it's really not. The black knight would be able to move to C4 and create a very unpleasant fork on the white king and queen at the same time. White would be forced to move out of the check, and then the queen would be gone. Getting back to our initial position, we can try to see what white should do instead. One thing we know, white certainly should not capture the knight on E5. In this situation, there are two directions to go. One is to try to make a move that would create the threat of capturing the knight. For example, by moving the king out of that potential fork problem that we had to deal with after queen takes knight. Now, black immediately would need to deal with the threat of the knight hanging, whether by protecting that knight with another piece or moving the knight away. Black would be immediately given a task. So therefore, it would be certainly a good idea for white to move the king. Now also, there may be other moves to give up on that idea of queen capturing knight and move, for example, the pawn up to F4 and attack the knight with a different piece. Either one are good options. Let's move on. And here we go. In this position, it is white's turn. And white made a move that at first seems to be a blunder. White captured black's pawn on B4 and gave a check. Now, if you wouldn't be suspicious and would think, oh, my opponent made a mistake, and would immediately quickly capture this bishop on B4, what would happen? You would allow a fork that would result in white winning the black queen, because knight checks the king and attacks the queen simultaneously. The king is needing to move out of the check Knight takes queen, and white is a full knight up. What a change from the starting position where black had an extra queen versus a bishop and knight. A major advantage for black. So was bishop takes b4 a winning move? No, it was not. It certainly was a good move because it won a pawn and on top of it set up a trap. But black by no means is forced to fall into that trap. Black has options. Capturing the bishop is only one option and in fact a bad one, as we learned. Black is much better off moving the king instead out of the check, for example to e6. The king and the queen are both completely safe now, and in fact white needs to worry about not losing the bishop on the next move, because now there is no more fork around, so the queen would be ready to capture the bishop. The king pretty much could move any square without any loss. So the only bad move here is capturing the bishop on b4. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. This is another tricky one. In this position at the moment, white has some material advantage, having a queen, while black has an extra rook and knight, but yet a queen is more valuable than a rook and knight combined, being worth only 8 points. White, in this position, has an option to capture several of the black pieces. White could capture the pawn on d6, or could capture the bishop on f2. Typically, we would be looking to capture the higher value piece, which in this case would be black's bishop. However, as I'm warning you, always look around and make sure it's not a sneaky trap set by your opponent before you just grab a seemingly free piece. In this case, if the white king would move and capture the bishop on f2, it would put the white king into a discovery situation. And what do we mean by that? That while the black rook cannot move and attack the white king at the moment, black sneakily can move his knight from f6 somewhere and anywhere, and that all of a sudden will result in a discovered check by the black rook. Now, moving the knight to d7 doesn't do anything, because even though it's a check, the king just moves out and the game goes on with white's material advantage. However, the problem is that after king f2, black can make a more accurate move and move the knight to a square where it not only gives a discovered check, but also at the same time will attack another valuable white piece. And that move is moving the knight to d5. So now the black rook is checking white's king, and at the same time the knight is attacking the white queen. White now cannot avoid losing the queen, because if the king moves out of the check, knight captures queen, or if white would try to block the check with the queen could be captured by either knight or rook. So what should white do in the starting position? Well, for one, white may capture the pawn on d6 without any loss of material. Much better than going for a bishop and then losing your queen. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. In this endgame, it is white's turn. And what should white do? White already has some material advantage. Not too much, just a rook versus bishop and pawn, which is worth only a 1 point difference. However, the most natural move is to grab another pawn on h7. Looks like a free pawn. Again, before you would move your rook and capture that pawn, be careful. Look around. Is it a trap or isn't it? In this case, it would be a major blunder to capture that pawn, because it would position your rook onto the same diagonal with your king, allowing the black bishop to step right in between, attacking the white king, check, and the rook. And that means the king needs to move and the rook is lost. Certainly not something you'd want to do. On the other hand, what you would want to do is make sure you don't lose your rook and try to win that pawn. The best way to accomplish that in this case is to give a check with the rook. Now, black is in a problem because if the king moves to c7 out of the check, white could just capture the pawn on h7 with a check, not giving black the time to move his bishop and give a fork. If after rook h6 the king would move to the other side to a7, then the problem would be that the rook would capture the pawn on h7 and pin the bishop that's on b7, and therefore the bishop would not be allowed to move, because when a piece is absolutely pinned, it cannot leave the king that's behind the bishop in attack or in check. And finally, if after rook h6, black would block the check with the bishop, still maintaining the trap that if now rook takes pawn, then bishop e4 forks. Of course, white would not capture that pawn on h7, but would make a simple quiet move, moving the king away from the diagonal, away from those light squares. While the bishop is pinned now, the bishop cannot go and protect the pawn. Black will be forced to move the king out of the pin, and then the rook will already safely capture the pawn, giving white a winning advantage. And finally, our last example of this lesson is this position. Right now, there is an unbalanced position, but pretty close, white having an extra queen and pawn, while black having a bishop and two knights. We can notice that the black knight on f4 seems to be in trouble. And in fact, indeed it is. The question is, how should we capture? The queen or the pawn? Or it doesn't matter, maybe? Well, as so often, as usually in chess, it does matter. Capturing with the pawn would be a decisive mistake, because it would open up the diagonal where three important pieces already stand: the white king, the black bishop, and the black knight. Right now, black has a discovery check at his disposal. And just like in the previous example, a random move to b3, while it would be a check, would not accomplish anything because the king could move out. However, the knight also can move to some very unpleasant squares, namely to e6 or e4, either one work, because now the bishop not only attacks the king, but the knight also attacks the white queen at the same time, giving black a major material gain. Going back to the starting position, we'll notice that on the other hand, if the white queen captures the knight, none of this will work because the pawn remains on e3 and there is no discovery in the picture. Well, I hope you got some ideas on how to look for traps and hopefully to avoid them. Thank you for listening, and so long until next time. Bye-bye.